Contain Inc. We are an alternate finance business that is dedicated to indoor agriculture. We work with growers who are working in containers, warehouses, and greenhouses. And we can work with basically any piece of capital equipment, so anything from robotics and automation to HVAC to LED lights and grow systems. We work on both leases and through our partners Interwest Insurance on insurance for growers. And this is our public vendor list. We actually work with 20-odd vendors at this point. Some of them are on this list because they either choose not to be or we haven't added them. So we work with everyone from some of the largest lighting companies all the way through to companies like PowerGrow, who is a startup who just did its first deployment. So part of what we do is we spend a lot of time thinking about data, and we're also finance geeks. And so I thought what we'd do for our presentation today, rather than talk about the growth of the industry or technology, I thought we'd take a different track and we talk about business models. So those of you who've been in the industry for a while will be well aware that it has grown extraordinarily. So there are now about 5 times the number of North American vertical and rooftop farms than there were even 4 years ago. Now, in this number, what we've included is folks who are growing commercially at scale, who are talking about their operations publicly. So we're well aware that there are some folks who prefer to remain in stealth mode, and we respect their privacy. And we're also well aware, because we work with folks like freight farms, that there are probably at this point somewhere between 200 and 300 different container farms growing in some way commercially. But this is folks like Aero Farms and Square Roots and folks that you would recognize that we've included in this list. So that's great. But what we also discovered when we were putting this together is that about a third of farms that existed in 2017 are no longer operating commercially. And now we know that we see a great deal of delight taken in this fact from folks who oppose the industry and seem to spend a remarkable amount of time writing bitchy comments on LinkedIn. But for us, it's an opportunity to learn. And we don't necessarily see it as a bad thing. It's a miserable event for any entrepreneur who loses their business. And I think that that's something that we should have respect for, particularly as we know that folks who've lost a business typically are much stronger in their second business. There are stats that show that your second business is usually better managed than your first. But also from a data perspective, it's something that we want to learn from. And so when we took a look at why these businesses are failing, it really falls into 3 categories. Technology, which is the fun piece to talk about, business model, and access to capital. Now, on the panel in a minute, we're going to talk about access to capital. And actually, it'd be great if someone could turn on my little timer here so I don't ramble for 3.5 hours. Thank you. But what I thought we would talk about in this session is the piece that is normally the one that when we sit down with farms that have not done so well, the one that they talk about, which is, I wish we'd had a different business model. And so we're going to talk about 5 differentiated business models today. I will say that every time we sit down with someone who's somewhat new to the industry, whether that's a new grower or a new investor, they always have the default assumption that the business model everyone is going to use is they're going to grow commodity leafy greens, butterhead lettuces, etc., and they're going to sell them to a supermarket. And we spend a lot of time with both groups saying, please don't do this anymore. And so this is really the genesis of this presentation. So what we actually see in the marketplace is folks using differentiated products. So here's, we did a study of across 46, I think, zip codes in late March of product pricing on leafy greens. And what became clear with the indoor grown product is that most of the time they were not growing commodity product. What they were doing was going to a supermarket and saying, we can give you something that no one else has seen. Now, this it's kind of cool on the face of it that you get to do baby arugulas and tatsui and products like that. But it's also really exciting from a retail perspective. And Hussman, who is here, Peter's done a fair amount of work on this, and what's become clear from those kinds of studies is that produce is a hero product. It's something that draws people into a supermarket. And so there is both a straight economic benefit of selling more product for the supermarket. More importantly, there's a halo effect. You become seen as a supermarket that can provide really cool stuff. You are remembered by folks as, well, actually, I'm going to go to that Safeway on the way home from work because they have that salad mix that I really like. And so this is really the tack that the larger vertical farms are taking nowadays. If you notice on this slide, the price of these products is pretty extreme. And now one of the retorts we get all the time is, well, that's all well and good, but only 5 people in Brooklyn can actually afford this. And that is exactly the same case that people made about Starbucks when it first started. People said, look, Dunkin' Donuts has 50-cent coffee. Why would anyone pay $3? Turns out that people do actually care about what they eat and are actually willing to pay more when there's a value to it. And so what we found in that study is that when you're doing some sort of spring mix, the products that were being grown in vertical farms were being priced at about a 40% premium. And that was not because they were just more expensive, though you could argue that in some cases they were. It was primarily because they were offering a very different value proposition and a very different product. So that's the first thing we always ask growers. What are you going to do that's differentiated? What are you going to do that's different? And so what this changes is the value of knowing the cost of a pound of lettuce. We have been asked more times than I can count, what's the average? There is no such thing as an average price of growing a pound of lettuce in any format, because there are so many variables that you are essentially looking at random walk. You can get any number you want out of a theoretical model, depending on the inputs you put into it. You can get whatever number you want. These we think are pretty close to what's happening in the real world, but these are some entirely theoretical models that we built for a client who was looking for some help. And the point I was trying to make with this one is actually, if you look, the differential between the growing costs is nowhere near as big as the differential in the selling costs. And so when indoor growers are thinking about how to price their product, the equation of setting a retail price and finding a product that can command a much higher retail price is at least as important as fretting about another couple of cents here and there within the farm itself. So the second model that we're seeing become very popular is in-store growing. And I'm going to highlight one company here, which is Smallhold. Anyone who's interested in produce tends to be interested in anything cool and interesting and different, and their mushrooms are gorgeous. They're very expensive, they're very esoteric, and what they do is they put small grow systems into restaurants and stores. There was someone earlier asking about food waste. What they do is you can go into a Whole Foods in Brooklyn and you can buy this product, but more importantly, they also use that product in the restaurants and in some of the meals that they use within the store itself. So if you're buying a Whole Food salad, they will put some of these mushrooms into it for you. So great curiosity value. When I talked to the company, they said actually one of the things they worry about is that children are really fascinated by this, and so they're hitting the glass all the time. But also a great way to differentiate your store. And for the grower, it becomes a challenge of managing logistics across multiple locations, not a challenge of trying to justify your pricing. Vertical integration is kind of a classic old school economic technique. It was the driver of all of the M&A in the 80s and early 90s. And we're starting to see it with indoor agriculture as the practice becomes more widespread. So a couple of examples here. Urban Crop Solutions, which is a Belgian technology provider. They do container farms and plant factories. They have been working with one of their grower customers, BonBio, and with IKEA. IKEA got involved in indoor agriculture back in 2015, 2016-ish, they sold an in-home system in their stores, and now they have a pilot that they're intending to roll out of a large container farm type structure, which is growing leafy greens that you can buy as an IKEA customer as you come out of the store. And anything that isn't sold the same day goes into their restaurants to be used for salad the next day. So given that the average lettuce takes, a week to get to the customer, they're still getting much fresher product. And there's no waste off of those systems. So Urban Crop Solutions' role there is they're providing the technology, and Bond Bio has a captive customer, essentially. A bigger vertical integration example is Sanem Bio. Sanem Bio is the largest LED chip manufacturer in the world, which means they know a ridiculous amount about LED lighting. They have a subsidiary called Oasis Biotech in the US, which has built what will eventually be a 210,000 square foot facility in Las Vegas, which it's not that big yet, but they have the land allocated there to do that. And publicly, Sanem Bio has committed $1 billion US to the industry. And to give you an idea of the scale of that commitment, the whole of the the whole of the North American industry, including the plenty raised from SoftBank, is just over $1 billion since 2009. And they obviously have significant cost advantages because of that vertical integration. The trend that's probably we see growing, pardon the pun, most is that of customer-dedicated growing. So we've seen a couple of announcements with airlines. Aerofarms is selling from their existing facilities into Singapore Air in New York. And a larger commitment is by Crop One Holdings, which is a Boston-based grower that won a competitive bid to build a large-scale plant factory with Emirates Airlines catering arm, which will be supplying both into Emirates and into various other airlines flying out of Dubai from the end of this year, I believe. The other model is one that was kind of derided by the industry from the get-go, which is Square Root's model. Square Root's model is we will take 10 folks who want to become farmers. We will teach them how to farm in 6 weeks, and they will grow in their own container farm on our 10 container farm campus. Initially, there was a lot of eye rolling that this model was never going to work, that it could never be profitable, and in fact, 3 years on, not only has it worked, but they're now rolling it out across the country with the support of Gordon Food Services, which is a distributor and also owns some supermarkets. So they have a dedicated customer built into their business model at this point. And funnily enough, one of the earliest companies in the industry, Bright Farms, has followed this model from the get-go. So finally, the one that I'm most excited about, and it infuriates me because we can't really talk publicly about a lot of what we see in this one, is supply chain growing. So if you have a need within your consumer product good, beauty good, or any form of manufactured good, supply chain for a reliable, consistent supply of a given crop-based ingredient, the odds are that you are going to be looking at indoor growing as a way of replicating that. And so, vanilla is a great example because it is hard to grow, and it comes primarily from one country, Madagascar, which has huge supply chain and growing issues plus weather-related issues, which means that the price does this. If you're trying to forecast your product pricing, that makes your life really hard. Now, I'm not suggesting that vanilla is going to show up in indoor systems tomorrow. It's anyone in this room who grows will know that it's a very hard crop to grow, but there are significant studies in places like University of Florida attempting to do this. We have already seen a couple of different examples. They are private, of folks using this methodology, and we're talking crops that are anywhere from $20 to $100 a pound. And as a consequence, have much better economics typically. A lot of them will never become public because they never need to raise funding, and they're not particularly interested in building a brand. But that's a really interesting one, and I think we're going to see a lot more of the industry going in that direction. So in summary, we don't see indoor agriculture as just growing leafy greens and selling them to supermarkets. We see it as having a much broader societal impact. And for us at Contain, our vision is really to be a part of that impact on the capital provision side. So I think with that, I'm going to say thank you, and I think I get to invite the panelists up.
Do you want to invite them up? Or do you want me to?
I think you should do it. I think this is Rob's show.
Okay. So thanks, Nicola. So joining Nicola on stage, we've got Nick Hausauer, VP of Equilibrium Capital. Sam Schatz is coming back up from AeroFarms. And Rob Trice is coming back up from Better Food Ventures. He's going to serve as the moderator.
Thanks, guys. There we go. Thanks, guys. Maybe we could start. Nicola, did you give an intro on Contain?
A little bit, but I can do it again.
All right. Why don't you just tell us who you are?
Sure. So I'm the founder of Contain Inc. I've spent actually about 7 years in the industry. This is our second startup. We exited our first at the tail end of last year, and we provide leasing and through a partner insurance for the industry. We do nothing but indoor.
Great.
And yep.
Great. Nick?
Nick Hausauer, I represent Equilibrium Capital. We are, I believe, the largest and only dedicated controlled environment facilities fund in the U.S. We're building a portfolio of large-scale greenhouses and are all eyes and all ears on working with the indoor vertical community as it goes. We're also in permanent crops and wastewater and anaerobic digestion.
And for those who don't know, Nick's team had a unique press release earlier that said, we've raised a $331 million fund and we've substantially deployed most of it, which is not the way it's usually done.
Yes, no, I mean, I think it just speaks to the excitement and the pace of growth in the industry.
Yeah.
And the need for external capital, which I'm sure everybody in this room on the entrepreneur side and operations side understands.
Sam.
Hello again. Sam Schatz, Managing Director, Corporate Development at AeroFarms. Practically, I lead the company's farm development, so thinking about where, when, how we build our existing technology across the globe. Joined the company back in 2013 as the first employee after the founders, so have worn many different hats, as I'm sure some people in the audience can appreciate. But it's been quite the journey thus far, and it's only just starting. So
The panel's topic is about financing of indoor, but I'm going to call an audible here, and let's discuss Nicola's presentation on business models and any reactions that you guys had to that. Not everybody at once.
Well, so I think generally there's a lot of interest outside of leafy greens, and I would definitely say that's in the pipeline, and that's something that we're very focused on. The technology of aeroponics and LEDs we really think it can grow anything. Obviously, not everything can be grown economically, but that's something that we're very focused on exploring right now, is how to grow plants better and do it in an indoor environment that allows for better reliability, lower cost production, using less inputs.
Yeah, and from Equilibrium's point of view, and we'll get into this a little bit more on what we view as a financeable project. When we think about business model, one of the challenges for us as we've looked at the indoor and vertical space has actually been the vertical integration that you talked to. You mentioned Santa Biotech and Oasis Biotech. I've heard slightly other rumors in the industry about how that project is going, and raises questions for us as we look for. We're not in the business of technology risk, we're in the business of operating risk. And when I see a vertically integrated company that says, I have technology, I farm, I sell, and I have a brand, that raises alarm bells for me, because it's very hard to be good at all of those things. I want to look at an operation and say, hey, this person, is smart enough that they're buying their lights from the right supplier, they're buying their climate system from the right supplier, they're buying their growing system from the right supplier. And yes, I can get comfortable that they can figure out how to operate that and turn seeds into dollars and turn dollars into cash flows. So when I look at vertical integration, that's the question that I see. But I think you're onto something. We see a lot of movement on, now you mentioned supply chain, growing, moving into what is essentially white labeling and food service. And we think that's going to be a huge opportunity as well, because, retail's nice, small niche local brands are nice, but what really drives down unit costs is scale. And who has scale? It's food service, it's distributors, and getting into that is what really we think is ultimately going to allow this to get to a much larger scale.
Yeah, I had two thoughts. One was, we were talking about vanilla and so forth, is how do you actually really get up to scale? And I don't think, you made that point that we're not going to be disrupting Madagascar anytime soon. The second thing is, I found myself still doing the eye roll on square roots. Fundamentally, the way that I look at that is, it's probably pretty harmless. It's not doing any damage. I think it probably has caused some dreamy thinking about scale. I don't know how real that distribution with Gordon Foods is on a regional or national basis. So I still found myself doing the eye roll on that, for what it's worth.
Sure, for clarity, we're not Pollyanna-ish about we work with growers every single day, so we see the good and the bad, and we do plenty of eye rolling of our own. I think one of the things that gets missed in a lot of these discussions is that for someone like Square Roots, this isn't necessarily just about cash flow. It's also about how do you create entrepreneurs. So they see it, I think, as a social benefit. Sorry, I'm not defending or decrying
Sure.
them. But when I talk with Tobias, he's not necessarily talking all the time just about the bottom line.
Right.
And so I think some of these social impact models they're not just about the economics.
Well, and the degree which you can get Brooklynites interested in growing food, that's a cool thing, right?
And now, folks in Illinois and folks in various other.
Yeah.
I'd say about 80% of the folks that we interact with, they don't come from farming backgrounds. Coming from a farming background is 2% of the country. It's in some ways an extremely privileged position for folks like myself who got to grow up in a farming family. It really was brought home to me when I was in India with a couple of colleagues once, and they were kind of scared of the cows that were wandering around the street. I'm like, why are you scared of an old, really tame cow? And it struck me, they've never been around. They've never been around animals of that size, and so of course it's something unusual to them. And about 80% of this industry is the same way. They have come to it from another industry. They've come to it from engineering, from finance, from some other discipline. And so I do think that someone like Square Roots is playing an important role in that.
Yeah. So let's get into this financing topic, okay? Why don't we look at things? I think let's just definitionally, if you're okay. We'll just call it sunless indoor, and we'll say greenhouse, horizontal greenhouse, just as a catch-all. If we were to look at that, there's different things that you can finance. You can make a land play, a real estate play. You can do an operations play. You can do a technology play, right? So if you kind of look at that, I think what's the appropriate kind of capital? When's the right time to fund? Those, I'm kind of laying this out as a checkerboard for you guys. Or a Jeopardy board, see who wants to take which cube. So who wants to jump in there?
I guess I could start because you have a slightly different perspective. So from a project finance standpoint, I think you have generally sort of three categories. One is the real estate. And when I say real estate, it's the corn shell, the land, the site work. That's the real estate portion of a transaction, and that will have its own financing, right? Because it's tied to the collateral, which is in that corn shell building. And I alluded to that in our last conversation. Then I think you have sort of the tenant improvements and critical infrastructure work, and that is a portion of that is maybe real estate, and a portion of that is equipment. You have your real property improvements versus your sort of personal property improvements. And that, I think, needs to be looked at differently. And then you have your actual farming equipment, and that is a separate set of equipment and collateral. And I think when we look at the financing, we look at those three buckets and how to optimize based on those.
Yeah, Sam, and it's interesting you mentioned that. One of the things that we've looked at and struggled with as we've looked at the vertical farming space is that notion of tenant improvements and farming equipment. Again, it goes back to, I think, to the question you raised of what are the different buckets of capital. You've got, venture capital for, new technologies or new operations or new companies, which I think we're seeing a lot of. You have growth capital for, companies that have been around for a while and have a proven business model. And as we've looked at vertical farming, we've asked the question, well, what is that collateral value, which has made it hard for us to invest? Because if I don't know that it's a proven technology and that, let's say we do a project with AeroFarms and, Sam defaults, can I lease it out to somebody else? Can I take it out to somebody else? Because if it is a proprietary growing system, then it makes it very difficult for me as an investor to know what the collateral value. When I look at a greenhouse, I can say, oh, it's a steel and glass box. It's got it's got 30 acres of high wire crops with a Priva system and lights from Philips or Lumigro. Our friends from Lumigro are out there. And at least I know that, okay, Windset and Master Nardi might have a slightly different view on how things should be laid out, but at least somebody, we can find a tenant or a partner to take that over and I can understand the collateral value. So that's one of the things that we're monitoring with the growth of the industry. And it goes back to this question of vertical integration. How do we get comfortable from a facilities investment perspective with what actually am I investing in? How durable is the value of that? If it were a different operating partner, if the business model changes or if technology changes, how do I understand the long-term value?
And Nicola, obviously, you're doing the equipment, right?
Sure, and so we really see the market as there's this kind of, and I apologize, Sam, there's this privileged 1% who have access to pretty much as much capital as they need. I mean, AeroFarms there's plenty of folks that AeroFarms can call on the capital side. The folks that you're funding at Equilibrium have they're a fairly exclusive group in that they can show this track record of growing and of building facilities. And then there's 99% of the industry. And we spend a lot of time thinking about how do you evaluate and measure the risk of some of these factors of novel technologies and rapidly developing technologies of operator risk. Within VC investing, that if you find a guy who can code and a guy who came out of GSB, then statistically you're doing pretty well. And there isn't that equivalent yet within indoor ag. And so one of the things we think about a lot is what makes a good management team. And the process that we're now going through is taking the data that we've gathered over the past 7 years and turning it into some proprietary risk measures, which are essentially encapsulating what our lenders are already asking us. A typical question we'll get back is, well, is this a good technology or not? We know there's X number of deployments, but is this a good technology or not? Is this an area where these kinds of crops are actually needed? And so that's where we put a lot of our time and attention, is translating that data into something that's usable by lenders.
Just in response to that, so I think venture capital is one source of funding. You have mezzanine financing, preferred equity financing. You have debt financing, and when I broke it out into the different categories, you can have equity and debt on each of those. I think from the VC side, the equity side, we have been fortunate to be able to raise what we need to continue to grow as a company. But I do think that, and this is back to the business model discussion, but if we are to really scale, whether it's leafy greens or another crop, if we're really going to scale our company and be able to build projects that can compete with traditionally grown crops, you need scale and you need a different type of capital. It's not venture capital. It's debt. It's project equity. It's different types of funding with different requirements that require collateral and appraisals and different underwriting processes, and that is more challenging, and that really requires you to have demonstrated, that your production process works and has worked at scale. And I think that's the difference, I think, in terms of how.
And how far away are we from getting there? Where we can access those kind of capitals for scale up?
Yeah, so I mean, I think we're there. We've financed our projects with a combination of debt and equity. We have future projects where we expect the same.
Yeah.
But you know, we're still, I think, not too far off. But you know, where we could go out and access like a large kind of debt facility, that's not quite there yet either. And so I think the cost of capital is really important because that is directly related to your unit economics. And if you can't compete with the unit economics with the field farm, then none of this is going to work. And so we all, I think collectively, ourselves and the other groups that are in the industry are all trying to tackle this problem. And as that cost of capital goes down, it's going to benefit everybody.
And you were educating me last night because we were having this discussion over barbecue about, what was it, 4 years ago or so, when you came out with that Goldman announcement. I was like, wow, I did not know that we were at a maturity in this industry that Goldman's going to project finance operations. And I think what you told me last night, I was a couple beers into the evening, but that they financed your real estate, but not necessarily your operations, right?
Well, it was kind of a combination, but it was mainly a real estate transaction that they were involved with. Where, you know, I talked about those three kind of buckets of capital. You had your real estate, your TI, and you have your equipment. They were mainly on the former two, but there's still, even in that middle bucket, there's you have to underwrite ultimately the tenant, and you have to be pretty darn sure they're going to remain a tenant for the duration of their lease, and that was absolutely a component, and we went through that process. So it's not. It wasn't equipment financing, straight up equipment financing, where you know they were, because we at that point when we closed that first funding, we had just raised our Series A. We were a much smaller organization. So,
You can say something. Yep.
Yeah, and I think actually you hit on an interesting aspect of financing that we've sort of left on the wayside is that notion of working capital and operations financing. When you look at, I'm just going back to what did you call it, greenhouses versus sunless. When we look at the startup of a 50-acre, 100-acre expansion, you need $20 million. You got crops to buy, you got 3 months of electricity, 3 months of labor before you get to your first. And there's only a handful of companies, have the balance sheet to do that. And we see requests from, projects that we're looking at, partners that we're working at. Well, can you lend me the money? Mm-hmm. Well, sure, but it doesn't look like the capital that I'm giving you lease financing at or project financing at. It's a different risk bucket, and the existing lenders out in the space, from the farm credits to the farmer max to they're not well conditioned to understand the cash flows and risk profile of a greenhouse or controlled environment operation. And there's not a good source of financing out there for it. So they oftentimes will go out and try to raise equity, right? Equity for working capital is also not it's an expensive form of financing. So there's a little bit, we don't quite have the full ecosystem yet, and in any aspect of the industry, and we're just sort of trying to solve for these different parts.
So, well, you were going to say something?
So the other one we should probably touch on, because I know Aerofarms has used it a fair amount, is non-recourse funding. So new market tax credits, opportunity funds,
right,
et cetera, et cetera. That's one we're seeing increasingly.
Yeah, that's exactly where I want to go. Is like, no, that's great. Thinking outside the sunless box. Like, what are the other kind of, new and emerging models that people should be looking at if they can't just go down a traditional path?
So the most common issue that we come up against when we get folks coming into us is that they're not realistic about what they're going to do. So we get folks who are coming in with a couple of $100,000 of equity into a project, and they want to do a $35 million debt raise. Not going to happen. So what we typically say to folks is, you have to be a little humble about this, as anyone who's built a business knows how tough it is at the beginning. So we say to them, go learn to grow, go get yourself a secondhand container farm, throw yourself together a hoop house and learn how to grow. Interestingly, that's how Aerofarms got started. Aerofarms started with a plant scientist and knew how to grow, right? I mean, that's Plenty started on Google's campus in a freight farm. the instant you can show that you can grow a leaf and you can sell it to a customer for a period of time makes you much more attractive to someone like Nick over time. So that's the first one, start small. And then the second one I would say is grab as much non-recourse funding as you humanly can. These kinds of projects are catnip to local USDA offices who write some extraordinarily large checks, several $100,000 sometimes, to support these projects. Go take advantage of that before you get to the point where you're actually paying for capital, which I probably shouldn't say because it's talking against our book. But.
Yeah, and I think, I'm not going to blame Aero Farms, but I think that there is definitely envy in those players that are more, maybe not as technology savvy, but are good growers, but they can't access the same technology because they don't have the same story. And they look at the big zeros that you guys, are the 1%, right? That you guys are actually putting on the board, and they can't follow, even though they're maybe even cash flow positive, but they can't access that money because it's more for the working capital, and there's just that gap in the marketplace right now.
Yeah, and I would add, just sort of circling it back to the start of the conversation on new market tax credits, opportunity zones. Our general view is come up with a good business model, come up with a good location. Oftentimes we'll see people bringing us, again, more on the greenhouse side, a greenhouse project that says, hey, I got this, I had a piece of land that had some geothermal wells on it. I want to build a greenhouse. Well, you're in the middle of Montana. Have you seen any people in Montana? Or they'll say, I've got an opportunity zone or a new market tax credit. And then you look at the climate, or you look at the distribution logistics, or the ability to hire management talent, and so you see people trying to solve for cheap equity versus saying, hey, I got a good project. So yes, I agree with that, but it also has to be, our view is from an underwriting point of view, the project needs to underwrite on a standalone basis that, yes, this facility, this location, this climate makes economic sense if we don't get any of that. And then when we layer that on top, it either brings down, it lowers the risk and brings down the cost of capital, or it sort of is upside to the investors. But we often find that people get distracted by those sort of bright, shiny objects, including USDA financing, which at the end of the day, usually it has a personal guarantee, which people don't realize when they go in and they say, hey, USDA is going to loan me money at 4%, and then they're like, oh, I have to guarantee this, and then the wheels come off.
And I can't tell you how many folks we get in who've gone this exact route, who've spent 4 or 5 months with their local USDA office being told they're going to get 4% money. And then they call us in a panic because they're about to lose their growing season, or they're about to lose their contract. Because when it comes down to it, either the local USDA guy can't actually give the money at that rate, or they just don't have, USDA has a checklist that's like yay long. And there's, box number 47 they can't tick. And so after 4 months of putting together paperwork and plans and writing business plans like it's the 1950s, they call us and say, is there anything you can do for us in 24 hours? So,
yeah. Travis isn't out there, is he? Travis, we talked yesterday, he was on stage talking about the fact that he is doing avocados and bananas in Idaho. And that basically there's no way that he can get that thing financed. It's got to be self-funded. So, yeah, I know Crop 1, they've got a big Reg D opportunity zone, I believe, in Texas somewhere, that they've gotten over the line. I don't think they've actually deployed yet, right?
I'm not sure. I haven't spoken to Sonia about that one. You may.
I just saw a press release. My understanding is that they launched it, but they haven't raised the funding. But I don't know if that's the case. But I think just to echo Nick's point, I mean, these projects, they have to underwrite, and these other sort of forms of financing can help with lowering the cost of capital of the project. We've done a couple of new market tax credit deals. They are very difficult to do. There are a lot of timing considerations. They're expensive to do, but they are non-recourse financing for projects. I don't think from a corporate standpoint, like from a R&D or kind of corporate activities, these kind of non-recourse mechanisms like opportunity zone funding or new market tax credits are as attractive. I think opportunity zones, maybe you'll see some some investment into corporates, but I think, from our perspective, we're continuing to look for, the lowest, the availability of capital and the lowest cost capital to help with our project financing.
So before we throw it open to Q&A, I have one crazy story about, well, I guess two. I mentioned this. I took this trip to China and Shandong, and I went to one facility that was a government fund. They had just built 1,500 new greenhouses on 1,500 acres, and it was basically open for business, for leasing. Another one down the road was some very nice, relatively new greenhouses that the city was building with housing on the outside. And so Grandpa had gone in there, and he was leasing an indoor facility for $3,000 a year, and then he had just financed that so that his son could operate one and his son-in-law could operate one. And so, I mean, the thing about China is they've got people that actually want to go and operate these. This is this town with 900,000 greenhouses, right? So they've got a lot of folks that are just willing to step in. But are you seeing other, overseas examples of other innovative financing mechanisms?
I mean, Singapore is a good one because the government there is, super proactive, ridiculously well educated, and they are certainly making capital available for folks who want to grow there.
Yeah. All right, that said, let's kick it open for Q&A. Questions? Comments? Criticism? Praise? No? Nothing? Yep, we got one in the front.
Kind of goes back to the original conversation. You mentioned leasing of greenhouses. That whole model of almost hardware as a service or farming as a service. Just be interested in your thoughts on that.
Yeah, so thoughts on farming as a service and leasing?
Yes, absolutely. And I'm hoping that I'll be able to talk about it more publicly in 6 months. So I would say, there's complexity to getting those structures to work in a way that that is beneficial to both sides. So essentially, you as a grower want to have the ability to have the newest equipment in your greenhouse at any given time, so you're not losing your competitive advantage on the grow side. And on the equipment vendor side, they want to put that equipment in, but there's a number of things you have to figure out in between those two stalls. So theoretically, it's very simple. When you get into the weeds of trying to figure out the docks, who has liability, who's actually going to service the equipment. If you're a terrible grower and you allow all kinds of nasty things to happen to the equipment, whose fault is that? At the end of the lease, who's going to own that piece of equipment, and at what cost? What does it do to the tax on your balance sheet, or to your tax liabilities if it's structured as one kind of lease versus another kind of lease? So it gets very geeky and very dull beyond the very cool concept of doing it, but it is something that we're working on.
And what about experienced talent to go into this kind of, is that a risk? You will or will not be able to find people to operate those?
Maybe.
Maybe.
For that particular structure, it's less of a risk because essentially the vendors are selecting who they want to work with. But yeah, it's all. In this sector, it's always a risk.
Great.
One thing that we're looking at is licensing. So, in that scenario where and this is mainly for international projects, but we're working with some of our a number of international partners right now on licensing agreements where they would have essentially some kind of a license to use our technology and deploy it over a certain period. And then in that case, we're looking at what is the business plan of their being able to go and develop and deploy our technology, and what is their ability to access capital to do that. And we obviously help in that effort, but ultimately, we're as the licensor, we're really doing our own underwriting in that scenario. So,
Other questions? No? Nicola, one for you then. We didn't really talk about crops. So cannabis is sexy. If I'm growing cannabis, might have a better shot on goal than if I'm growing kale to get financing.
Yeah, no, we get this question a lot. We're not in the business of financing cannabis, not because we don't think it, we have some ethical objection to it. One, it's still illegal in the U.S., so for federally regulated pension investors, you can't touch it. But two, as somebody once likened it to me of, investing in cannabis production is a little bit like investing in hops at the end of Prohibition. Yes, there's a lot of money to be made right now. People are making a lot of money because it's, hey, I'm the first guy on the block. I'm selling it, I'm growing it for $2 a kilo and I'm selling it for $7. We're already seeing that evaporate. We're already starting to see a move to commoditization, particularly for CBD and hemp and all of that. So that's going to go away, and I think you're going to see the people in cannabis who make real money are the people at the end for value-added processing, branding, items. The amount of people who are smoking THC is going to go way down. And when you're not smoking the THC, you don't care as much about the quality. Well, you do care about the quality of it, but you're going to be able to standardize it through processing and everything. So, would I put $500 million into a cannabis greenhouse right now? No. But I think people are making money in the short term. But what we see is, again, it's all about scale, just like it is in all these other crops. And that's not how the first entrance to the space we're approaching it. You see a lot of 3-acre greenhouses that are being built for $45 million. They got lights, HVAC, all the stuff you need, but then you got somebody up in Canada who just acquired Sunselect's greenhouse and put, $100 million into 70 acres. And from what I understand, the cost of production is going to be about that, right? And that's where the market is moving. So I would have a lot of concern about financing if I, with a different hat, financing a small operation. I would have to study where do we think the market is going. The difference is, people are always eating tomatoes. People are always eating cucumbers. People are always going to be eating lettuces. And we think that these crops are on a one-way street to controlled environment. You're not going to go back to growing field tomatoes for cherry or grape or cocktail or, same thing's going on for mini cucumbers and it's going on for lettuces, right? Yes, there'll always be a field presence, but it's sort of a one-way street.
I think anyone in your position is trying to evaluate risk, right? And I think that there's just a lot of risk in cannabis because of pricing. And if you look over the horizon period of a 10-year loan, maybe you see pricing to be pretty stable for the next year or 2 years, but then what happens? How are you going to pay that back?
So we cover produce, insects, mushrooms, nutraceuticals, ingredients. We don't do cannabis, and the reason we don't do cannabis is that the issue that we're trying to solve for is how do you reduce the cost of capital for the industry as a whole? So we are trying to understand the grower from every different aspect. How good of a grower are they? How does their behavior within the farm change their risk profile? And you can't solve for that across everything. Right. Cannabis has a very different set of risks. My personal concern is with cannabis when we started looking at it was there's this almighty event risk you have coming, which is the day the federal prohibition gets taken away, there is a tsunami of capital that is waiting on the sidelines. So for us as a small company, what are we actually bringing to the table in that? We're taking a legal risk, which our lawyers are not. I already got the lecture from our lawyer about writing dirty and all the rest of it. So I don't want to take that risk in return for a payoff that I just don't see being there from a financing perspective, not from a growing perspective or any other perspective.
Excellent. On that note, you got one. You got a quick one. You heard insects, Virginia.
Yeah, I was going
to
ask.
Make it a quick one. We're running out of time.
About new crops because there's come up a couple like vanilla, for example, or insects, which are indoor grown but less known, and obviously finance wants to know as much as they can. So I'm just curious if any of these sources of finance that are being developed in the indoor grow market are open to other crops, and how much that. Sort of there's the innovation piece if you have a different farming system or a different crop, and how does that impact the financeability of it?
So right now, because there is very little secondary market data, pretty much everyone is equal. And so yes, absolutely, we've got, I don't think we've executed a lease on an insect farm yet, but we have definitely got lenders to say yes, they'll do it and to offer rates. So please call us.
I have a similar perspective to that. We always look at crops and categories by scale. And this isn't to say somebody can't make money growing vanilla, but our business is in providing scaled capital facilities and scaled capital solutions. And so when we look out and we say, yes, insects, alternative proteins, huge category, huge opportunity, hugely capital intensive. Same thing with land-based aquaculture, and we're looking at these and monitoring them for, when they get to mature. And it goes back to my original thing. I'm in the business of buying operating risk and underwriting operating risk. I'm not there yet, but I think when those sectors mature, they are large and scalable, and they have the same macroeconomic trends that indoor vertical farms do, right? Very capital intensive, and it's a big category. A lot of lettuce, a lot of protein, a lot of fish.
Excellent. On that note, please help me thank Nicola, Nick, and Sam.